So today's video is about to be a little different than what some of my people out there may be used to receiving or seeing of me, hearing from me, etc. I want to use this as an actual teaching, sort of direct lecture style video. And as opposed to bringing in outside materials, I want it to be direct, as if we're sitting in a classroom. And oftentimes I do my best not to come from that place on purpose, right? I don't want to just be the person who is telling you what to do and what to think, etc. But I feel when it comes to this specific subject, especially in context of where we are in human history, it is of the utmost importance. So what I want to get into is this idea about leftism, or quote unquote progressivism. They've hijacked the word liberal, so they tend to use the word liberal or liberalism, but it's overall leftist ideology. And more specifically, how leftist ideology has never changed. You know, if you were to look back to Leninist, Marxist, Stalin version of leftism, it is the same as today's leftism. The only distinguishing difference is essentially the Trojan horse that they've chosen to deliver this ideology through, or in essence, how they're presenting it. Now, last night, right before I went to bed, the last thing I watched was an episode of a documentary, or I guess documentary style series called How to Become a Dictator. They have different versions, like how to become a cult leader, etc. And they basically break down the inner workings of these similar patterns within each of these, maniacal, I guess, cluster B sort of Machiavellian personality type individuals. And I'm deeply interested in this stuff selfishly because I want to always make sure that I'm vigilant. I'm constantly aware that I'm not being bamboozled and, finding myself in that cult-like ideology myself. So in this episode, they were breaking down in context of Stalin, Joseph Stalin, the Georgian, how would you say that? I believe it's Georgian or Georgia-born Soviet Union leader who essentially was responsible for the massacre of millions of people who opposed him, and should be held in the same regard as a Hitler, in the same regard as a Mao Zedong, and some of these brutal dictators and leaders throughout history. But yet, because he understood a principle that is still used by the left today, let's just say history tells a very different story, or mainstream history tells a very different story than the reality of who this man actually was. And I use the term mainstream for a reason, because those who have dug beneath the surface understand the brutality of not just the man, but the ideology that is pervasive today. When you're hearing these kids talking about how they're communists and how they're being conditioned or brainwashed into communism on these indoctrination campuses, it's the same exact indoctrination that took place in the USSR, right? It's the same thing that was happening in the Soviet Union. It has not changed its format. Instead, it has changed its vehicle, how it shows up. So today we have this sort of imagery of tolerance, acceptance, right? The leftist shows up as, as scripture would say, as the angel of light. I am goodness. I am peace. I am merciful. It's all a facade. It's all a lie. And this is directly connected to the Stalin-esque way of doing things, which is controlling the narrative. This specific episode I watched was actually on exactly that, is creating a new truth. And in order to create a new truth, you must be in control of the whole narrative. And so at the beginning of his political career, when he was building his way up and he was put in charge of, let's say, the Communist Party in different capacities, while Lenin was still in control, Stalin positioned himself as just this sort of meek, humble individual who just wanted to, push papers. In essence, a lot of people actually thought of him as just a glorified paper pusher. And he was not only okay with that, but he designed that. He created an infrastructure for himself where it seemed that he was just this guy who simply cared about, the Communist Manifesto, about the people. It's about the worker, down with capitalism. Capitalism has been the reason why our people have been suffering. Now, of course, if you know anything about anything, you know that's a complete lie. And that capitalism has done more to bring people out of poverty than any other economic system, period. However, it's about controlling what the truth is. And so there was a moment in Stalin's story where right as Lenin is about to die, Lenin was very suspicious at the end of his life of Stalin. Not saying that Lenin is a good guy, right? But if, it's like if a demon is looking at you crazy, how dark are you really? And so he was becoming suspicious, but instead Stalin decided to, again, create a narrative for himself. He was essentially manipulating the story for the purpose or the sake of what was being projected into those who would become his constituents and, who would become his subjects as he built this empire of self. So as Lenin is dying, he's close to Lenin and he is telling stories as far as, the closeness and the brotherhood they had. And when Lenin dies, Stalin commissions some artists to do the first quote unquote Photoshop job of him and Lenin sitting together. So there's an actual image of them sitting together. They're both relatively, I guess, smaller guys or not big old guys, but Stalin has this artist create him or mold him into a larger figure. He brings them closer together on the bench as if, they were basically skin to skin. And I think there was a few other aspects of that were manipulated to create this imagery that would then be kind of this known image of Leninism and what he disguised himself saying Marxism. So it was Marxism and Leninism were the two ideologies and doctrines that Stalin would push, but really it was about his own power. Now, I say all this to set this up. Leftism is about power as much as any other system, political structure, whatever it may be. As a matter of fact, it is the most obsessed with power, but it gets its power in a covert way. And I recently came across a video where a gentleman was sharing an article, and this article was essentially expressing how they had done a study of how in the healthcare space, there are more cluster B personality types, which is narcissism, bipolar, borderline personality disorder. I think is bipolar in cluster B? Somebody can correct me on that. But narcissism for sure, psychopathy, sociopathy, and borderline personality are within the cluster B. There are more narcissists in the healthcare space than essentially any other space. Right? In whether it's social work, it is nursing, doctors, home care services, things of that nature. I think second on that list is probably going to be teachers. And most people think to themselves, wait, why would somebody who cares so deeply about people find themselves in such an occupation? But we're looking at that backwards. It's what better place for a person to hide that is actually malicious in their intention? They're looking for power. What better place than to put themselves in a position where they can justify, quote unquote, their own goodness to themselves? And when you look at leftists, this is the mentality that they move through life with, right? Have you just looked at one of these folks? The genuine true leftist. I'm not talking about somebody who just simply lost their way, looking for a little bit of acceptance and, meaning, and then they're on their journey to big T truth. I'm talking about those who are given over, who are possessed by this. Right? The social activists, the social justice warriors, the one who will burn your car down because they no longer like, the guy that they were worshiping just weeks ago and forcing you to buy his car. Those type of individuals, the ones who would pull up to an ICE facility and spray the place up and take the lives of the people they purport to actually want to save. Those types of individuals. Many of these individuals have these cluster B personality types, and I would tie that into the spiritual quotient, demonic possession, actually. I know we think that we're too sophisticated for such ideas, but if you don't put that reality into context, then you miss out on a lot. I'm just going to say it that way. And so, to bring it back to sort of the structure of how leftism gains control and power, it goes through the power of the people. That's its front, its frame. Again, the Democratic Party, or at least the leftists within the Democratic Party who have usurped full control and power at this point, it's not that they just started not caring about these groups or they started being intolerant. They never were. It was always about control. From day one, it was like Stalin became the guy who would then, massacre masses of Christians and other religious people, or, whoever else would sort of be in opposition to him. He even had a rule out, or I guess a statement, which was, if you take the lives of 100 people and 5 of them were in opposition to, what we're building here, i.e. him, then you've done a good service. You've done a good job. Imagine that. If you take 100 people's lives and 5 of them were in opposition to me, then you're a good person. That skewed and warped sense of morality, or self-created in order to serve one's own, and I call it what it is godhood. He wanted worship just through other means. We see this time and time again, where here's a party who cares so much about a human life, yet they would push for policy where human life is erased at the very earliest and most vulnerable stages, up to the day of birth. Check out Minnesota's policies. Check out what Tim Walz got going on over there. That's leftism. Leftism will destroy you because the means justify the ends. And the ends, the actual ends, are full and absolute total control and dominion. Period. And so therefore, the truth is always used as a weapon. That's why the consistency in lying. I mean, Karl Marx himself, a self-professed demonologist, not in the sense of just studying, I guess, but somebody who had quite a relationship with the devil, in his own words. Karl Marx stated that in time of war, which is essentially always for the Marxist or the Leninist, or whatever you want to refer to them as, communist, etc. In times of war, accuse your enemy of doing the thing that you are doing in order to create confusion. So there is an allotment and an allowing of lying. And if we go to scripture, it's real simple. Yeshua, the Messiah, said in himself, he said, if you are a liar, then you are of your father, the devil, who has no truth in him, period. It's all a house of, it's called a house of cards, but it's all built on lies. There would be these propaganda pieces of how good a man Stalin was, all of these fluff pieces, we would probably call them today, building him up, lifting him up. He would seize control of all publications. He would destroy those who would not be in alignment with him completely. That's true fascism. It's kind of like, remember when a past sitting president had every single one of his social media accounts banned? That sort of censorship, that sort of fascism. That's the leftism we're looking at today. And I this was brought to my heart, I believe, this message, because we need to start looking at things more clearly, as opposed to, I guess, in sort of context, right? Sometimes it's helpful to look at things in context. Don't get me wrong. I'm always a fan of looking at things individually, but when it comes to understanding, we have to understand core principles. That's why, as much as some may be offended or rubbed the wrong way, whatever, spirituality has to be at the core. Because behind all things that are physical is the spiritual, the unseen realm. That has influence then on all else that is taking place. And I'm not trying to give just a simplified version of this. It's actually so complex, most of us can't fathom it. That's why it takes for a mighty God, who is the purveyor of all knowledge and wisdom and understanding, to reveal these things. That's where true discernment comes from. It is beyond your evaluations and your studies and all these sorts of things. Beyond that is an intelligence that is greater. So it has to start at that level. But then on top of that, you have to look at things from human psychology, quote unquote, right? You have to look at the psyche. You have to look at the ways of, the quote unquote subconscious or the unconscious, and how these certain systems operate and how they're used in order for those who are power hungry to essentially do what we're now seeing today. And all of this is only possible when you have people who have been primed for this. So when you have, perpetuation of, and which are things that are relatively synonymous with communism, you have abject poverty, you have abuse, you have, actual violence, you have all these sort of degenerate behaviors that spawn from your society, a godless society, because communism cannot exist with the true and living God. It can't, because that God desires for your allegiance. In communism, the state or whatever dictator finds himself in a place in a position of power, they require your complete and absolute submission and allegiance. So they cannot coexist. So again, once God is gone from the equation, then all else goes. Your godly morality is gone. And I've heard many people say, well, you can be moral without God. And I say, where did you get your moral compass from? Why is good good and bad bad? Well, it just is because we just are. No, well, wouldn't you need some sort of arbiter of good and evil, of right and wrong, in order for those things to essentially to satisfy? I mean, otherwise, it's not wrong. It's subjective. And a lot of this leftist ideology is also about subjectivity. When we don't call certain things wrong and we're afraid to offend or whatever it is, then we allow for those things to pervade and permeate. And so, in this sort of introductory piece into communism and a deeper dive into it, or Marxism, whatever you want to label it as, right? Leftism and its sort of its all controlling dictatorial root structure. I really want to make it clear as we continue that if you think that you can just be somebody to sit back and just sort of see this as entertainment or whatever it is, you're doing yourself and everybody else a disservice. I'm not trying to create some guilt complex. I'm just saying this straight up. If you're not talking, at the very least, showing up to those teacher meetings or those, city hall conferences, whatever it is, in whatever capacity, in your everyday conversation, if you're not calling wrong and right, and also living the right way, if you're not right within yourself, then forget about it. Because that's how we got here in the first place. That's how we got here. We got here because we thought that we could just sort of, duck behind, well, I don't want to get involved. We don't talk politics. We don't talk religion. We don't talk this. We don't talk. No, you did not assert your own belief system. And so they did. And they crowded yours out. And the propaganda won. The lie became the truth. If we are not active in that, eternally vigilant and bold in these things, I'm not saying you got to create a platform, but if that's what you're called to do, please do it as of yesterday. But if you're not called to something like this, it has to be in daily life. And again, as I said, underpinning all of that is spirituality. It is your relationship with God and what that means. I don't write the rules. I'm just a messenger. So don't ever get it twisted when it comes to what leftism is, what this so-called wokeness is. It has always been the same. Do not be confused about why do these people believe themselves to be tolerant, but yet they're the very opposite. It's always been about power. Whether you are a covert or overt narcissist, you may have somebody who comes to you with this sort of meekness and gentleness and false humility, coming as an angel of light. But truly, they're deceptive. They're wicked. They want power. There are mothers who suffocate their children, not in the physical context, at least not always, but, they smother and they do all these things because they want power. They manipulate and they lie because they want power. Fathers who do the same thing. They want power. They want control. You ever heard of Munchausen syndrome? Where a mother will literally cause their child to be sick, or Munchausen by proxy, where a mother will cause her child to be sick just so she can get attention? Will risk her child losing their life so she can get attention? It's power that they're after. And once we come to understand that aspect, it makes sense. Appreciate you guys for tuning in. Now, if you'd like to stay around, make sure to click that little subscribe button down there, or you can show some love by going to the description below and clicking on the button titled Buy Me a Coffee. Leave a little something there, or click on the Cash App. Leave a little something here. Till the next time, peace.
I've been up for hours, I've been up for days, staring at the ceiling, I've been counting strays, I've been in my feelings, I've been out of mind, I've been getting visions of the other kind, I've been up for weeks, I'm in the count of blessings over count of sheep. I can never be the type to limit when it comes to me. I used to be the pleaser for the people, I ain't even